most popular questions in the study of human evolution is, what were the first humans like? I'm not talking about the first members of our species, Homo sapiens, but the first members of our genus, genus Homo. What were they like? What did they look like? What did they eat? Were they intelligent? What would it have been like to meet one? The answer to this question has changed over time, evolved, if you will, as the hominin fossil record has filled out over the decades. Originally, in the 1960s, there was a suite of characteristics or traits that you as a specimen or as a species needed to have to be in genus Homo, to be in our club. This list was devised at the same time as the discovery of the then oldest member of our genus, a guy you may have heard of before, named Homo habilis. Today, I'm going to teach you a little bit about this troublesome hominin and other specimens and species like it, seated at the very beginning, near the origin of our genus, genus Homo. We're going to talk about some new discoveries, including the discovery of a new partial skeleton belonging to this species, and I'm going to break down why these guys, the earliest members and specimens of our genus known, make it so difficult to understand what the first humans were like, because we don't know how to define human. And this is one of those rare situations where having more fossils makes it more difficult to do so, not less. Let's talk about it. Before we get to that, I have something that I would like to shill to you, if that's okay. If you are an undergraduate student or a graduate student and you are interested in learning how to do real paleontology and specifically paleoanthropology in the field at a famous real fossil site, please keep listening. The Koobi Fora Field School, and I'm reading this from their website, is a program open to undergraduate and graduate students who want to learn about the basic principles and field methods of paleoanthropology on location. Students will receive hands-on introductory training in all of the major disciplines within paleoanthropology, paleontology, archaeology, geology, taphonomy, and ecology. Students will learn about these subjects and then engage in primary data collection, being a part of an active research project in order to make meaningful contributions to our understanding of those fields. Basically, this is an educational fieldwork learning opportunity that's being put on by a collaboration between George Washington University and the National Museums of Kenya, which incidentally is where I do all my data collection, have done all my data collection in the past. It's where I bought this shirt, even though I have never done this field school. I have, however, seen the field school leave many times and also arrive back many times. I know the people who put it on, I know the site is really cool and high yielding, and I know that people who come back from having done it, as some of them are in my doctoral program right now, are always super happy with their experience. One of the guys involved, Francis Forrest from George Washington University, reached out to me and was like, hey, you do this kind of thing, and your audience knows that you do this kind of thing. Would you give us a shout out? And I was like, yeah, obviously. I would love if more people were involved in biological anthropology and in paleoanthropology in general. So I'm giving it a shout out. This is not a sponsorship or anything like that. I am not making any money off of this. I just know people who have done this field school and they've loved it. I love field work and I want you to love field work and also to go do it and discover an even more complete Homo habilis skeleton than the one that we're going to be talking about today. So if this sounds interesting to you, if you're, again, an undergraduate or a graduate student and you would like to take an online course and then do 6 weeks out in the field at Koobi Fora, you should do this. Well, okay, you should apply. I can't guarantee that you'll get in, but give it a shot. Tell them I sent ya. So in 1959, the hominin fossil record was kind of bad. Well, okay, it was bad compared to now. It was pretty good for the time and only getting better, but the hominins that we knew of were few. We had Neanderthals from Europe and Asia. We had Homo erectus, mostly from Asia. We had Australopithecus africanus from South Africa. We had Paranthropus robustus, also from South Africa. And we had a lot of material that was sort of in orbit around those four primary species, sometimes assigned to species that no longer exist today, sometimes assigned to species that do, but more or less share a lot with one of the four that I've just mentioned. You're probably thinking, where's Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, my beloved? And that hominin isn't going to be discovered for almost 15 more years. It's easy to forget that the timing on all of this stuff, discovery-wise, shapes our modern understanding of human evolution. It wouldn't be until the discovery of Lucy that we realized just how human-like the Australopiths were below the neck. So suffice it to say, in 1959, most of our hominin species fell into two discrete categories: the very primitive human relatives, Australopithecus and Paranthropus, and the derived close-ish to human relatives, Homo erectus and Neanderthals. Again, I am simplifying for the sake of comprehension here, but there's a lot of minutia going on that I'm explicitly not mentioning. I will not be talking about Telanthropus capensis today, and on top of that, the fact that scientists had only recently, in the grand scheme of things, come around to the idea that most of human evolution took place in Africa. Prior to the year 1920, most, if not all, of the hominin fossils that we knew of came from Europe and Asia. Then, in 1925, we saw the discovery and publication of this little cutester right here, the Tong child, and the type specimen, or first specimen, assigned to the species Australopithecus africanus by Raymond Dart. This fossil right here, I believe, is the one and only time that a discovery has actually changed everything we thought we knew about human evolution.
Okay. Are you f***ing me right now?
This guy is going to shift the tide in our understanding of the where, when, and how of our own evolutionary history, but even though it was published in 1925, it wouldn't be until decades later that the scientific community and the general public would warm to the idea, and paleontologists would actually go to Africa to look for fossils. The reasons for the glacial acceptance of this idea is really twofold. The first is a little event that ramped up in the latter half of the 1920s for all of the 1930s and then the 1940s as well, and whose effects were felt into the 1950s and really onward to today, called World War II. And the second is Henry Fairfield Osborn. We'll talk about him another time. The TLDR is he was a pretty influential guy in paleontology in the United States, and he thought that humans actually originated in Asia. And so there was many a wild goose chase that sort of sent people out looking there instead of Africa. I wonder why that could be.
Oh my God, it's woke. Turn it off. Yeah, let's go.
Stop pushing your agenda.
Anyways, this is the critical context that surrounds the foray into Eastern Africa by paleoanthropologist duo Lewis and Mary Leakey in the 1950s. They had been drawn to Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania by large mammal fossils, and by 1959 they'd found a lot of stone tools, but not much else with regard to hominin remains. Lewis had discovered one molar that was extraordinarily large, but the thing is, stone tools were found in the same layers as that gigantic molar. And at this time in 1959, people thought that stone tools, that tool making in general, was one of the hallmarks of being human. Maybe it was the thing that made humans human. And because of that, according to the Fossil Trail by Ian Tattersall, Lewis Leakey thought that instead the molar belonged to a truly enormous human child, not of the Australopithecine type. Shortly afterwards, Mary Leakey would discover the type specimen of Paranthropus boisei, a small-brained, huge-toothed hominin descendant of genus Australopithecus, and the sister genus to our genus, genus Homo. And thus Lewis had a problem, because now we had a definite non-human in the same set of layers as stone tools, and that just wouldn't do. Lewis was sure that they would find another hominin there at Olduvai, a non-Paranthropus, non-Australopithecus hominin, and the actual maker of those stone tools, the Oldowan stone tools. Famously, Louis Leakey would turn out to be surprisingly right and devastatingly wrong in his assessment of Olduvai Gorge and the hominins therein. And what's crazy is he would find this out in 1960, the next year, and then progressively more detail up to 1964. In 1960, Louis Leakey received word from Jane Goodall. Jane was a young woman who he had sent to study chimpanzees at Gombe Stream National Park in Tanzania. The idea was that in order to understand human evolution, we needed to understand the behavior of some of our closest living relatives. So he'd sent out 3 young women, Jane Goodall for chimpanzees. He would end up sending Diane Fossey for gorillas and Birut Galdikas for orangutans to investigate the nature of the great apes, at the time known as the Pongids. I imagine Louis Leakey expected Jane to tell him all about their social systems, how they moved around, what they ate, things like that. He did not expect her to tell him and the rest of the world that chimpanzees manufactured and used tools. This changed a lot. Famously, Louis Leakey responded by saying, "We must change the definition of tool, change the definition of man, or accept chimpanzees as human." I have to imagine, too, this forced Louis Leakey to very briefly reckon with his preconception that Paranthropus boisei, then known as Zinjanthropus boisei, with its small brain, couldn't have made those stone tools, that there must have been another tool maker. Because that brain was bigger than the ones chimpanzees currently had, and if chimps could make tools with their wetware, then why not Paranthropus boisei? Louis Leakey was wrong in thinking that tool manufacture and use is what made us human, because as it turns out, as we very much appreciate now, many, many, many animals make and use tools of all sorts. But he wasn't wrong about everything, because it turned out there was another hominin there at Olduvai Gorge, and it may very well be the one that had made those stone tools. OH7 was a collection of bones belonging to the same individual found that year in 1960 by the Leakey's team. It was a jawbone or mandible with teeth still in it, 2 parietals or portions of the brain case, and a hand. OH7 was definitely not Paranthropus boisei, because if there's one way to recognize Paranthropus, it's the teeth. Specifically, Paranthropus as a genus is known for having enormous molars and molarized premolars, in addition to heavily reduced canines and incisors. This new mandible, OH7, had smaller molars, smaller premolars, larger incisors, and a much bigger brain, one that looked capable of thinking up how to make stone tools. Combine that with a hand that appeared to have both a precision and power grip, capable of actually manufacturing those stone tools. Between 1960 and 1964, several additional remains were found and attributed to the same species as OH7, whatever that would end up being. In much younger layers there at Olduvai Gorge, remains that looked very similar to Asian Homo erectus were found as well. The OH7 etc. material clearly wasn't Paranthropus boisei, and it wasn't Australopithecus africanus, and it wasn't Homo erectus, and so in 1964, it was assigned to a brand new species, perhaps the most primitive member of our genus, genus Homo. It was dubbed Homo habilis, or the handyman, and thus one of the most controversial hominin species was born. A lot of people didn't like the idea that Homo habilis was in genus Homo. Some people still don't like that it's there. At the time, with just that scant 1964 material, Homo habilis stood as a connector between the more basal Australopithecus and Paranthropus and Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis onward. It linked the two together in morphology and in time. That was not controversial. What was controversial was allowing it into our club. Of course, since 1964, 64, we've discovered more than a dozen new species, depending on how you split them, as well as thousands of individual fossils belonging to hundreds of individuals, and these specimens represent everything from isolated teeth to full skulls to full skeletons. Included in that collection are full skulls or crania and partial or full skeletons that are right around Homo habilis, bracketing it on either side, with late Australopiths and early members of genus Homo alike. So we can now ask the question, is what Homo habilis is resolved? The answer, of course, is no, but it's not Homo habilis' fault. Genus Homo and genus Paranthropus both descend from genus Australopithecus. We know very well what genus Australopithecus looks like. We have full skeletons from these things and partial skeletons or full crania from several different species. We have the same situation for Homo erectus in a broad sense, where we have full skeletons and partial and complete crania from this species. We know pretty well what Homo erectus generally looked like. Australopithecus is like a small-brained, bipedal, apish-looking thing, whereas Homo erectus looks a lot more familiar to us. It's also bipedal, but the brain is bigger, the face is flatter, it's using a lot more tools, and so on and so forth. So, if Homo erectus descends from Australopithecus, we need to fill in that middle part, and that's the role of Homo habilis and other early members of genus Homo. The reason I'm saying it like that is because there is a rather large collection of fossil material that does morphologically or physically seem to span the gap between Australopithecus and Homo erectus, but we don't know what belongs to what. When I say that, I don't mean we don't know which bones belong to which specimen. I'm saying we don't know what to call them. We don't know where to define where Australopithecus ends and genus Homo begins. This is exactly what we would expect, and in fact, what Darwin specifically predicted from human evolution. If humans descend from more basal apes slowly across geologic time, it should be difficult to draw the line of where human begins. It should be like trying to pinpoint where orange is on a color gradient of yellow to red. Technically impossible, but functionally useful to us. This is why even though species are not real biological entities, at least in my opinion, because that's what evolution would predict, we still try to define them so that we all know what we're talking about. It's a useful method of communication in biology, and a necessary one, I would say. But should all of that be considered early genus Homo, or should some of it be allocated to genus Australopithecus, or its own genus, a genus that bridges the gap between Australopithecus and genus Homo? I will leave that to you to decide, but I'm going to pitch my case. Let's take a look at what we've got, from skulls to postcrania or skeletal material below the neck, and see if I can't bias you towards my opinion. Welcome to the gutsickgibbon Anatomy Lab, where I teach you about the wet bones just underneath your skin. We're going to begin with some major differences between Homo sapiens and Australopithecus, because if Homo habilis is supposed to fit in between these guys, we need to establish the characters that are supposed to be bridged. You know, if evolution is true. We'll begin with the intuitive basics. Homo sapiens has a much larger brain, and the brain seems to have this globular shape to it, where across the top of the cranium and then towards the back, we see this sort of round shape, beginning with a big vaulted forehead that just sort of tucks back here behind. Whereas with Australopithecus africanus, represented here by the Mrs. Plez cranium, we see a much smaller brain, whereas humans are at about 1,200 to 1,400 cc's, or cubic centimeters. In Australopithecus africanus here, we're really going to be maxing out in the whole genus at about 550 cc's, or just under half the brain case size of humans. They also lack that characteristic vaulted forehead seen in humans. We have a much lower, longer platycephalic cranium that doesn't have that same tuck back that we see in humans, giving it that characteristic globular shape in us that isn't there in Australopithecus. They obviously have a much snoutier face. We call this prognathism, whereas humans are orthognathic, not nearly as snouty. And flipping these guys upside down, we can see that although the foramen magnum, or hole at the base of the skull, is certainly forward, suggesting an upright posture in Australopithecus, it's not as forward and upright as we see in humans. They also have a more rectangular palate. This is more akin to what we see in Miocene apes compared to the parabolic palate that we tend to see in humans. Modern humans also have a stark projecting nasal bone that's going to anchor our big honking noses, whereas in Australopithecus and in most earlier hominins, we don't tend to see that projecting nasal bone. It's more like chimpanzees, where their nostrils kind of lay flat on their maxilla here. Looking specifically at the teeth, which I hope you can see just a little bit better now, I'm going to show you some aspects of the dentition that are pretty stark. First and foremost, obviously, the entire tooth row is longer in Australopithecus as compared to Homo sapiens. They've got that rectangular palate, again, compared to the parabolic palate seen in Homo sapiens, and the individual teeth are different between these two species, or really genera. All of the teeth in Australopithecus are absolutely and relatively larger than what we see in Homo sapiens, and the premolars that we see in Australopithecus are single-cusped or unicuspid, as compared to the bicuspid premolars that we see in humans. You can feel this yourself. Prod your premolars with your tongue and you'll feel two cusps instead of one, like a canine. Australopithecus as a genus is also characterized by postorbital constriction. Postorbital means behind the orbits or your eye sockets, and constriction means it looks like someone is sort of pinched as if it was made of clay, this area of the cranium directly behind the eyes. The purpose for this in Australopiths is that this makes more room and more anchoring space for enormous temporalis and masseter muscles, which sort of thread through the zygomatic here and attach along the side of the cranium. These guys were big, heavy chewers, as supported again by their massive teeth. Humans, on the other hand, lack postorbital constriction. We've expanded this entire area, ostensibly, to sacrifice chewing surface area and strength for big, honking frontal lobes. This is Homo habilis. Specifically, this is KNM ER 1813, one of the smallest brained of all our Homo habilis crania. Its brain case size in cc's is only 509, within the range of Australopithecus. Homo habilis has a more vaulted forehead, a more globular brain case, and a less prognathic face than Australopithecus before it. In Homo habilis, the palate is more parabolic, it's deeper, and the tooth rows are shorter, as seen in Homo sapiens as compared to the earlier Australopithecus. That foramen magnum is also in a more Homo sapiens position as compared to Australopithecus as well, indicating a more efficient bipedality as well as perhaps more time spent on the ground. Similarly, Homo habilis has less postorbital constriction than the Australopiths which came before it, expanding out that frontal region side to side or laterally just as it did superiorly. So it's got a taller forehead and less postorbital constriction than Australopiths, more similar to the human condition. There is no confusing this thing, for example, with Paranthropus robustus, whose enormous molars completely dwarf Homo habilis in size, who has a wider face, and who even, if you tilt it upwards in the case of this specimen, has a sagittal crest, or a big keel that runs along the top of the cranium that allows the anchoring of really powerful, beefy temporalis muscles. The morphology, which is super well preserved, obviously almost in its entirety in KNM ER 1813, matches that which was initially, at least in some cases, inferred. As a friendly reminder, hominins, like all mammals, are bilaterally symmetric, which means the left half and the right half mirror one another. If you have one side of the fossil, you know what the other side looked like as well. OH24, which was again one of the first Homo habilis specimens found, is, when we take this into consideration, pretty remarkably complete. Most of the mandible is well represented, some of the neurocranium is well represented. The face is decently well known, and of course, most importantly for the case of hominins and comparison to earlier Australopiths in relation to bipedalism. When we turn these things upside down, that foramen magnum in Homo habilis is far more anteriorly positioned than what we see in Australopithecus africanus. You may be getting the vibe that Homo habilis essentially looks like if you took an Australopithecus cranium and pulled a handful of characteristics in the Homo sapiens direction. That's pretty good intuition, because that's basically what happened here. Homo habilis is one of the earliest members of genus Homo, and genus Homo descends from Australopithecus. So we would expect for the very first members of Homo to look more like Australopithecus in the majority of characteristics, with just a handful of traits moving in the Homo sapiens direction. So you might be wondering, why is Homo habilis included in genus Homo at all if all of the derived aspects of it are just exaggerations of what already existed in Australopithecus? Well, I'll tell you, initially in 1964, the reason was pretty simply those stone tools, because stone tools had never been found with genus Australopithecus, and manufactured stone tools worked as a pretty nice Rubicon for genus Homo, something that once you cross it, you're definitely in the club. You might be wondering, why were stone tools the Rubicon if we knew that chimpanzees were using tools, and now we currently know that they also use stone tools? And the reason is because the stone tools that chimps use are not manufactured. They're not altered for a new purpose and then put forward for that purpose, as the older one stone tools have been argued to be. Prior to the stone tool Rubicon, it was the cerebral Rubicon. You needed to have a brain case size of at least 600 cc's to be in genus Homo. But we soon discovered that there were members of genus Homo that had brains that were smaller than 600 cc's that were using stone tools. And since that cerebral Rubicon was associated with technological innovation, it became clear that you can have a smaller brain and do some pretty cool stuff. So that ought not to be used as like the barrier for genus Homo. Instead of the brain, it became the tools that the brain makes. And that works as long as Australopithecus didn't use stone tools. And it did use stone tools. After the year 2000, we discovered stone tools at a site called Leakey, where we only find Australopithecus/Craniodental, and also cut-marked bone at Leakey, where we only find Australopithecus. So what that tells us is that Australopithecus was using stone tools to cut meat off of bone. And that sounds an awful lot like something that we previously thought only genus Homo was doing. So that means that everything about the head and also within the head that Homo is doing, at least if Homo habilis is the first member of Homo, Australopithecus is also doing that stuff. So why is Homo habilis in genus Homo? Maybe it's something below the neck. We've spent all this time talking about the face and the head and the teeth, but what about the postcranium? Maybe that's where genus Homo can find its identity. Well, as far as postcrania goes, we have a lot of isolated material, and then we have two partial skeletons. Psych! Make that three. Ta-da! About 2 weeks ago, Fred Grein and colleagues announced a new partial Homo habilis skeleton in their open access paper titled New Partial Skeleton of Homo habilis from the Upper Burgi, or maybe Burgi, I'm not sure, member in the Koobi Fora formation at Illoret, Kenya. Now, normally when I'm just covering one paper, I would have given you the background as to our understanding of the postcrania of Homo habilis up to this, and then I would let you know how this new partial skeleton changes things. But the thing is, this partial skeleton doesn't really change a whole lot. A lot of the elements that we have in this partial skeleton are repeats from other partial skeletons, so it helps confirm a lot of what we know, but it doesn't bring a whole lot that's like groundbreaking, brand new to the table. At least that's my understanding. To that end, I'm getting a couple of new stomach ulcers seeing some science communicators that I like a whole lot talking about this new skeleton like it's groundbreaking and, changing everything we thought we knew about human evolution, which, gestures angrily to the Tong child, but that's fine. That's fine. I'm glad that people are excited about human evolution. But we're also not going to spend a whole lot of time on this paper because there's an additional paper that I want to bring to the table, and there's a lot to talk about anyway. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this paper for a current understanding of what Homo habilis looks like below the neck. So first off, what's new? What did we find that's brand new? Well, we've got K&M ER 64061, which is a partial skeleton dated to about 2-ish, call it, million years ago. It is composed of a clavicle, some scapular or shoulder blade fragments, both humeri or bones of the upper arm, both ulnae, both radii, and a fragmentary sacrum and os coxae, that's portions of the pelvis, making this the most complete Homo habilis skeleton recovered thus far. I know, you're hearing that and you're like, that doesn't sound like a whole lot complete. How is this the most complete one? It just is. When you got both arms, like almost in their entirety, excluding the wrists and hands, that's pretty good. I would have preferred that we would have one complete arm and then a complete leg, because then we could reflect it across the midline, but we don't always get what we want. They note here, just as I said, the upper limb elements are similar to those of other early Homo specimens. So, not quite changing everything we thought we knew about human evolution, not quite changing our understanding of Homo habilis or of early Homo, since a lot of what we have is similar to, the other partial Homo habilis skeletons that we have, and, it's okay, I'm not bitter, I'm not upset. Notably, the humerus is slender, with a weakly projecting lateral epicondyle, a relatively wide capitulum and narrow trochlea, and the ulna has a relatively large radial notch. They're just telling us some of the interesting morphology about the arms here. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a second. They say, although it doesn't preserve a lower limb, limited features of the ischium, so this is a portion of the pelvis, suggest the lower limb mechanics are more similar to Homo than to Australopiths. Okay. Well, that's interesting. Brachial index estimates support previous conclusions that Homo habilis had long forearms compared to Homo erectus, and all upper limb elements possess strikingly thick cortices resembling the condition in Australopiths and other early Homo fossils. The stature is estimated to be little. This is like a little guy. The body mass estimate is light. Again, this is a little guy. Smaller than Homo erectus, about the same size as Australopithecus. This specimen indicates that Homo habilis retained a more primitive proportion and was smaller in stature and mass than Homo erectus. So basically, in sum, just like the cranium and the teeth and the face, it is mostly like Australopiths, with some characteristics that pull it away from Australopithecus and more towards genus Homo. We're doing a lot of supporting previous estimates, previous thoughts, previous hypotheses here with this additional skeleton, but in sum, Homo habilis has really long arms. The brachial index means that it's got longer forearms than it does the upper portion of the arms, and the portions that are preserved from the lower portion of the body, namely the pelvic complex here, pull it more towards genus Homo, as do some minutiae of the arms. Here's a picture of the partial skeleton. What I hope you notice is that it's mostly arm. The skeleton is mostly arm. It is the most complete skeleton of Homo habilis with regard to how many bones are actually preserved, but as far as like the information it conveys, I'm not so sure that it would hold that in comparison to OH62 and others, given that we've got mostly arm here. It's a lot of repeats. We're looking at some redundancy here. Still, most complete skeleton overall. That is of note. That is really cool, and as they said, we're confirming a lot of previous hypotheses here about Homo habilis, about its relative limb proportions, and so on and so forth. We've got some really wonderful, as I said, this is open access, so you can go check this out yourself. We've got some really wonderful figures here to show you, like, okay, what parts are actually preserved? Again, mostly arm. We've got the clavicle and itty-bitty portions, although they are informative portions of the pelvis. There's the clavicle. The clavicle is mostly mosaic with the arms looking more Australopithy and the pelvic section being much more like genus Homo, specifically, again, they say Homo erectus. I'm mostly just flipping through this so that you can see some of these remains as we get down to the conclusion, where they've got a really lovely section where they sum up what we actually know in sum now regarding Homo habilis' postcrania. So they've got a bunch of really lovely graphs here that are going to show you where specific elements plot. This is not what I think is important for today's video, but please do go check it out yourself if you'd like. Eventually, we are finally going to reach, as I'm scrolling, what I'm actually looking for. Here we are, summary and discussion. There's a lot more that I just scrolled past and had to edit out. They say, together with OH7, KNMER 3735, and OH62, the other partial skeletons, This particular specimen, KNMER 64061, is only the fourth specimen attributable to Homo habilis in which postcranial elements are associated with diagnostic craniodental remains. So remember, the fossil record has a glut of teeth. That's why, in part, a lot of our diagnostic characteristics are tooth-related, because an animal is really hard to destroy, and it's really good at preserving itself. So a lot of the times when you've got isolated remains, the way that you can sort of associate it with other such remains, other fossils in the fossil record, is using the teeth. So this, along with those other skeletons mentioned, are like definitely Homo habilis because they match our type specimen for Homo habilis and other craniodental remains that we know are Homo habilis. They say comparison with these other three fossils are obviously limited to the homologous elements they preserve. So you have to have the same element in the fossil to actually compare them to each other. Luckily, we've got a lot of arm similarities going on between these partial skeletons. For example, KNMER 64061 lacks any manual elements, so there's no hands, and the only postcranial bones of OH7 are hands. So those cannot actually be compared. They're going to walk us through some of the bits that are actually able to compare here. Here we summarize the comparisons that have been detailed in the foregoing sections of this paper with reference to elements comprising KNMER 64061. They start with the upper limb, the stature, and the body mass. So in how big is it, and in the arms, it's mostly going to be similar to genus Australopithecus as compared to Australopithecus, African apes, and modern humans. They say compared to the length of the humerus, the clavicle is relatively long, similar to what we see in most Australopiths and recent humans. Clavicles tend to be shorter in one specific species of Australopithecus, Australopithecus sediba, and African apes. The brachial or radiohumeral index, so the ratio of the length of the forearm to the length of the upper arm, is high. Basically, it looks like these guys had really long forearms. That's more African ape-like. It's most similar to gorilla, but chimps have even longer forearms. The estimates for like the stature and for the weight, this thing is little. It is like an itty-bitty, teeny tiny guy, not like what we see with the increase in body size in Homo erectus onward. It's like 60, 70 pounds and short king or queen energy. In the long bone cross-sectional proportion, so this is looking at like bone density, right, and robusticity of that cortical bone, it's really, really high, like high in comparison to recent humans, but that's just the case for a lot of hominins, right? So they note here that it's actually pretty similar to the high values that we see in Homo erectus, which is a pretty human-y looking hominin, as well as genus Paranthropus, and like not like Australopithecus. So it seems like after Australopithecus, Paranthropus and Homo, all the way to Homo erectus, continues to get like denser and denser cortical bone here. The midshaft of the humerus, the midshaft of the upper arm here is like moderately rounded. They say this is most like Australopithecus, but those ranges in general are pretty wide, and the characterization of the upper arm here in relation to the midshaft shape is like pretty similar across all apes, or I should say across all great apes. And it's like pretty similar across all of the Homo habilis remains that we do have. The torsion or twistiness of that humerus is more similar to African great apes and Australopiths than later members of genus Homo, which makes sense because Homo habilis is still spending a decent amount of time in the trees. This is like a transitional species for moving from arboreality to terrestriality. Then they have this section on additional morphologic attributes. So with relation to the clavicle, it is flat in general. It looks pretty similar to all of our other hominins. It's not particularly diagnostic. The scapula or the shoulder blade, the bits that are preserved here, they look like Homo erectus or like Australopiths. It's not particularly striking there either. The humerus is gracile instead of robust like the humerus as a whole, lacking any well-developed entheses or like big ridgy muscle attachment sites. So it's pretty similar to OH62, the other Homo habilis specimen, as well as the Trichonoboi here, the juvenile Homo erectus specimen that we have. So it seems like early genus Homo is united with like less robust overall humeri, which again suggests that we're committing less to the trees and more to the ground than the Australopiths before them. There are aspects of the radius and ulna, or the bones of the forearm, that look more like Australopithecus and aspects that look more like later genus Homo. For example, the radial notch of this new Homo habilis specimen is more similar to Australopithecus, but the radius as a whole resembles other early members of genus Homo as compared to Australopithecus. So, yet another example of transitional individual bones in these hominins. Finally, they talk about the bits of the pelvis that are preserved, which seem to be, in the case of the ischium, that's the preserved portion here, short and dorsally oriented with a narrow tuberoacetabular sulcus. In these features, it's like other earlier members of genus Homo, and is very different from Australopithecus. They specifically point out here that this seems to be a consequence of the ischial tuberosity being closer to the acetabulum and more dorsolaterally oriented than in Australopithecus. Basically, this is, as they say here, maybe reflecting a hamstring mechanical advantage in Homo as compared to Australopithecus. So a transitional ischium here, specifically with relation to how the hamstring operates. If you've been keeping up with this channel, you know why that's kind of funny. Despite having a relatively long forearm, this new specimen, this new partial skeleton from Homo habilis, appears to show the first evidence for a more modern hamstring function than in Australopithecus, in which the ischium is longer. So now, let's put it into context here at the end, in current knowledge of Homo habilis postcranium. The hand is a transitional bag. With regard to OH7, they look at Kivel et al. From 2021 and found that it appears that the fingers indicate powerful grasping ability for the high loads associated with arboreality, combined with a human-like set of carpals or wrist bones that are evidently together, creating a hand that likely accommodated both arboreal locomotion and enhanced manipulation. The carpals or wrist bones are more human-like than those of all other fossil hominins prior. So what is the hand like? Well, it's something that can make tools and also get around pretty well in the trees. Transitional. The limb proportions have been a subject of contentious debate for quite some time. Initially, especially with OH62, it was argued that the limb ratio was actually more primitive than even what we saw in Australopithecus afarensis, or Lucy species, that the arms were longer and the legs shorter than ostensibly more primitive hominins. That's probably not the case, as outlined in this paragraph here. We're probably looking at Australopith-like limb proportions, but not more primitive than genus Australopithecus. Essentially, Homo habilis is generally characterized with long arms, short legs. The femur is more like Australopithecus, so we're looking at something that is bipedal, but not modern human style bipedal, or like even Homo erectus style bipedal, whereas the upper limbs are more of a mixed bag. They are primarily more like Australopithecus, but there are aspects of it, particularly in relation to the radius and the distal humerus, or the more lower down portion of the humerus, that look more like Homo erectus or even Homo sapiens. This section is specifically looking at the postcrania in partial skeletons, so this isn't including, for instance, isolated, very informative bones attributed to Homo habilis, like, for example, OH8, which is a mostly complete left foot that we have that preserves the three arches and the inline hallux. It basically looks like a little mini human foot, but of course we know that that was the case for many Australopiths as well. They sum things up here at the end that I'm going to read for you because I think it's helpful in summarizing things. They say in sum, say that a million more times, insofar as they are known, the Homo habilis partial skeletons present a picture of postcranial anatomy that tends to differ from other members of our genus, with the caveat that the postcranial skeleton of Homo rudolfensis is currently unknown. We're going to talk about Homo rudolfensis here in a second. This seems to be particularly evident with reference to body proportions and the potential use of the upper limb. Such differences were a major consideration in Wood and Collard's 1999 suggestion that Homo habilis might be more comfortably accommodated in genus Australopithecus. Indeed, Johansson et al. In 87 had earlier commented that the relatively derived Homo erectus postcranium at 1.6 million years ago and a postcranially primitive Homo habilis at 1.8 million years ago may imply an abrupt transition between these taxa, a scenario that Leakey et al. In 89 were clearly uncomfortable with in reference to KNM ER 3735. So they're basically saying, okay, everybody appreciates that Homo habilis is postcranially pretty primitive compared to Homo erectus. And given that partial skeletons are like pretty close in time, only 100,000 years apart, if we're proposing that Homo habilis directly evolved into Homo erectus, that has to happen pretty quickly, something that not everybody is down with. And they say this primitive postcrania is and has been a reason why people in the past have proposed that maybe habilis ought to be an australopith. They continue. Of course, the preponderance of craniodental synapomorphies, or shared derived characteristics that specimens of Homo habilis share with other members of genus Homo, clearly identifies the species as a member of the Homo clade, even if most of its postcranial characteristics speak to a generally more primitive australopith grade of organization. So what they're saying is that, yeah, like the postcrania of this thing are pretty primitive, but everything regarding the face and the teeth and the brain case seems to pull it in the direction of Homo, and we don't see that in any australopiths, meaning that this thing is, even if slightly, definitely set apart, and definitely set apart in our direction. So in sum, according to this most recent partial skeleton, and then looking at the Homo habilis partial skeletons and craniodental features as a whole, we have a hominin that has a, compared to Australopithecus, more human-like face, more human-like teeth, and more human-like neurocranium in shape, not size, because the size is actually more similar to Australopithecus, attached to a body that has long arms, but a humanish-looking wrist, curved fingers for getting around in the trees, a pelvis that is more human-like than any preceding Australopith, legs that are still pretty short and stubby, and feet with 3 arches and an inline big toe. Insofar as the term can be used, Homo habilis is the perfect transitional species and a bona fide ape man. But to be clear, the term should not be used. You can so easily see why it's difficult to place this thing confidently in genus Homo, because unequivocally, it has characteristics that align it more with our genus than Australopithecus, but it's still just so primitive. And yet, this is exactly what we would expect the very first member of our genus to look like. Overwhelmingly, still very apish in the primitive old term usage of the sense, but with just a handful of characteristics that pull it towards us, that would have looked, should we have encountered them on the landscape, very familiar. Now, if you will, I'd like you to indulge me for a moment, because we should see the change from Homo habilis in the smallest brain members like this one in 1813 transition to what we see in humans over geologic time. This is one of our larger brained members of Homo erectus. Specifically, this is a reconstruction of one of the Peking specimens, a brain case around 1,000 cc's. So call this 1,200, call this 1,000. This one is 509. We need to see a lot of changes from here to here, don't we? Really, we need to go from here, Canem ER 1813, all the way to here, the big brains that we see in Peking Man. And it's not just a change in brain case size, we also need to see a change in their faces and in their teeth and in the shape of the skull or the cranium, right? This is Canem ER 1470. This is a member of Homo rudolfensis, a very closely related hominin to Homo habilis here. Both of these guys are about 1.9 million years old. Remember, Peking Man is significantly younger than that. These guys are less than 500,000 years old. I should say these guys and hominins like them. This is Dmanisi skull 3, a member of Homo georgicus, or a very early member of Homo erectus, known from Georgia, specifically the Dmanisi site in Georgia. This is the first really non-contentious hominin fossil material found outside of Africa. These guys are from around 1.7 to 1.8 million years ago. 1.9, 1.8. This is Canem ER 3733, a member of African Homo erectus, or Homo ergaster, if you want to go with that. It's about 1.6 million years old. This is Canem WT 15,000, or the Turkana boy, another member of African Homo erectus, or Homo ergaster, and it's about 1.6 million years old. As you've hopefully been seeing by looking at your screen, and definitely not listening to this while you're doing other stuff, if you have been, come back and check your screen now. You can see the increase in brain case size from Homo habilis all the way up to Asian Homo erectus. It is completely covered. I've removed Homo rudolfensis and our Peking Man specimen here just for the sake of space, but you can see the change in face shape as well. And for the record, in dentition and palate shape too. And look at those foramen magna. Magna? Magna. Look at those foramen magna. But maybe you're the kind of person who doesn't find looking at things to be convincing. Maybe you want something more quantitative. Good news. This is an open access paper by Karen Babb and colleagues titled New Reconstruction of the Dan 5 Cranium from Gona, Ethiopia, supports complex emergence of Homo erectus. And this is going to be a reconstruction and then a pretty big geometric morphometrics analysis of all crania that we have for early Homo, or I should say most crania that we have from early Homo. So we're going to get to see how a lot of the specimens that we just looked at actually map up against one another when you quantify their shape. This is a cool paper, and I'm going to go ahead and read the abstract to you so you know what we're getting at here. The African early Pleistocene is a time of evolutionary change and techno-behavioral innovation in human prehistory that sees the advent of our own genus, Homo, from earlier Australopithecine ancestors by 2.8 to 2.3 million years ago. That would be the time frame for our earliest genus, Homo specimens. This was followed by the origin and dispersal of Homo erectus sensu-lato across Africa between 2 and 1.1 million years ago, and the emergence of both large-brained and small-brained lineages in the Middle Pleistocene of Africa. Here we present a newly reconstructed face of the Dan 5 cranium from Gona, Ethiopia, dated to 1.6 to 1.5 million years ago that, in conjunction with the cranial vault, is a mostly complete early Pleistocene Homo cranium from the Horn of Africa. Morphometric analysis demonstrates a combination of Homo erectus-like cranial traits and basal Homo-like facial and dental features combined with a small brain size in Dan 5. The presence of such morphological mosaic contemporaneous with or post-dating the emergence of the indisputable Homo erectus craniodental complex around 1.6 million years ago implies an intricate evolutionary transition from early Homo to Homo erectus. This finding also supports a long persistence of small-brained and plesiomorphic Homo groups alongside other Homo groups that experience continued encephalization through the early to middle Pleistocene of Africa. So, we can make a prediction right off the bat here given the age of Dan 5. If Dan 5 is about 1.5 to 1.6 million years ago, my prediction would be, and of course I already know the answer, but you can make the prediction yourself, would be that it should be craniofacially and craniodentally, and with regard to the neurocranium, most similar to the Homo erectus specimens of its same age, right? So that would be KNMWT 15,000, or the Turkana That would be this specimen. This thing is open access and very good, so you can check it out for yourself, but I'm going to go directly to the analysis after stopping on some of our cooler figures here so you can see locations and the reconstruction itself, because I want you to see where it falls. So here's a PCA, or a principal component analysis, of 3D cranial shape in Dan 5 and a comparative sample of Pleistocene Homo. A principal component analysis takes landmarks and converts them into principal components, or directions of change, and it tries to find those principal components which capture the most amount of variation within that data set, regardless of the individual labels. And I know, because I've done this. I'm doing this for my dissertation. You can trust me on this. Figure 3 here is comparing PC1 to PC2, and it looks like we're capturing about 45-ish% of variation with these first two principal components. That's another big advantage of a PCA, is it can take high dimensional data, which is typical for shape space, and reduce that dimensionality so you can plot it and see what things look like. So we're looking at axes of change here, directions of change, and you're basically just summarizing, quantifying the shape and seeing where things fall. In orange or yellow here, this is going to be a bunch of our early members of genus Homo, or I should say Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis. Again, at 1.9 million years of age, we have OH24, we have 1813 and 1470, all of which we looked at. They're plotting this nice little triangle here. And then down here in the red is Homo erectus. And in purple here, I believe that's Neanderthals. And I think blue is just regular old Homo sapiens? Yeah, I was right, in Homo sapiens. So for PC1 versus PC2, Dan 5, our 1.6-ish million year old cranium is plotting quite nicely with Homo erectus, with the rest of Homo erectus, as we would expect. And in fact, there's our Turkana there's this guy, super close to it right here, as well as Dmanisi skull 3, or D2700. That would be this thing right here that we also already looked at. Remember, we're looking at like face shape here. This isn't even taking into account brain case size. So that's PC1 versus PC2. Again, directions of change in either axis. Now they're going to incorporate PC3. So now we've moved PC1 stays on the x-axis, and we've moved PC2 off and put PC3 here. And still, Dan5 plots most similar to other members of Homo erectus. Really, it's closest to Dmanisi skull 3 here. Here's our Turconaboid down here. Again, we've got all of our early members of genus Homo together, with Rudolfensis being kind of off by itself. It makes sense that Homo habilis would plot closer to Homo habilis and that Rudolfensis would be off by itself when the three are plotted together. Basically, we've got a really nice layout here of face and neurocranium shape, and it is exactly as we would expect for the evolutionary progression that I just showed you in brain case size, as well as, evidently, face shape. But it's not always that simple. So that's looking at overall cranial shape. Now we're going to home in specifically on mid-face shape, which you can see here in figure 4, where we have a PCA of mid-face surface shape, or topography for Dan5 versus our others. The colors have changed a little bit here, so we're still looking at red being Homo erectus, orange here being habilis and Rudolfensis, blue is still Homo sapiens, magenta is now like that awkward cluster muddle in the middle of like not quite Neanderthal, not quite sapiens, not quite erectus group, and then we have Neanderthal still here in purple. So Dan5 is plotting somewhere in between Homo erectus and early members of genus Homo. Less one here, this is Lassetti. So this is Homo naledi, which is plotting with these other more primitive members of genus Homo. Again, just as we would expect. Homo floresiensis is much closer to Homo sapiens up here. And this is PC1 versus PC2, which looks to be explaining about 52% of the variation here. And then now we're doing PC1 with PC3. And for PC1 versus PC3, Dan5 is looking really primitive. Like, it's looking more primitive than it ostensibly should, right? More similar to our early members of Homo being like closer to 1813 and OH24, our Homo habilis stuff here. Looking at the tooth row here, things are also kind of weird. So we're looking at tooth size apportionment. So we're looking at all the post-canine dentition, P3, P4, M1, M2, and M3. Its size correlated, and the measurements are, as you would expect, mesiodistal and buccolingual, buccolingual and mesiodistal. And Dan5 is plotting off by itself, but like pretty similar to OH16, our Homo habilis here, which is kind of interesting. Of course, everything is sort of a big smattering here. It's not super unexpected, in my opinion, to see some pretty high variation amongst early genus Homo and Homo erectus. I do wish that we had an Australopith outgroup here. So we see a similar thing looking at the tooth shape or the occlusal outlines for all of the post-canine teeth. Dan5 is sometimes plotting by itself, and sometimes it's plotting right where erectus and the habilis group sort of overlap, the habilis and Rudolfensis group overlap. And sometimes it's kind of close, but not quite there. But the discussion paints things rather clearly for us, I think. They see the Dan5 reconstruction from Gona, Ethiopia is a complete early Pleistocene homocranium from northeastern Africa. Dan5, to our knowledge, is the first African fossil to exhibit a mixture of Homo erectus and early Homo features. Some facial and possibly dental traits in Dan5 appear to be derived from Homo erectus sensu lato, and then they list them here: deep palate, maxillary sulcus, projecting brow ridge, canine jugum, small premolars, corroborating previous work from the neurocranium. Yet, the Dan5 fossil, like the Dmanisi sample, so they were very deliberate in saying that this is the first African fossil to exhibit this mixture, because the Dmanisi sample does as well, blurs the boundaries between early Homo taxa, particularly classic Homo habilis and Homo erectus. Dan5 overlaps Homo habilis and early Georgian Homo erectus with regard to endocranial volume, relative palate size, and dental dimensions. They finish further down, saying the Gona evidence, that's Dan5, the one they've reconstructed here, along with that from Dmanisi, hints that key behavioral and technological innovations may precede major morphological transformations. Diverse lines of evidence point to a broadened dietary range and access to animal resources at both Gona and Dmanisi. Moreover, both Mode 1 and Mode 2, that's the Acheulean stuff that's usually limited to Homo erectus, stone tools are documented at Dan5, yet the endocranial volume of Dan5 and Dmanisi fossils show minimal expansion over early Homo. So what they're saying here is we are definitely seeing Homo erectus-like behavior with Dan5 and with Dmanisi, despite the fact that their brain case size is more similar to our beloved Homo habilis. And not just their brain case size, the shape of their face and the shape of their neurocranium, as well as the shapes of their teeth individually and the tooth row. They conclude here, the Dan5 fossil confirms that the emergence of Homo erectus was not a simple story. The Dan5 site documents hominins with a combination of ancestral and more derived craniofacial and dental features who made both Mode 1 and Mode 2 stone tools. So just like what we saw with Homo habilis and with Australopithecus before it, in early Homo erectus, if we're broadening it that much, we see more complicated tools preceding the expansion in brain case size. You don't need a massive brain to do some pretty cool things. And just like we saw with Homo habilis overlapping with Australopithecus in many dimensions, Homo erectus overlaps with Homo habilis in many dimensions, just like the more basal members overlap with more derived members of that same species. What I'm trying to say is all of these guys overlap with each other. Any trait that you use to pull Homo habilis into Australopithecus is going to pull some members of Homo erectus into Australopithecus. Put brutally, these two overlap, and these two overlap, and these two overlap, and these two overlap, and for that reason, it is extremely difficult to draw a line and say this is where genus Homo begins, due to the linchpin that is Homo habilis, the 1813 group in particular. The more fossils we've discovered, the more we've realized that just as Darwin predicted, these species, these genera bleed into one another in accordance with our expectations of evolutionary theory. Descent with modification, slow morphologic change over geologic time. Darwin wrote in The Descent of Man in 1871, it would be impossible to fix on any point when the term man ought to be used. And in one of my favorite papers on human evolution from 10 years ago in 2016 by the late Bill Kimball and Brian Vilmore, titled From Australopithecus to Homo, The Transition That Wasn't, we see, indeed, the expanded brain size, human-like wrist and hand anatomy, dietary eclecticism, and potential tool-making capabilities of the generalized Australopiths root the Homo lineage in ancient hominin adaptive trends, suggesting that the transition from Australopithecus to Homo may not have been that much of a transition at all. Every characteristic that we would or even could use to define genus Homo emerged first in genus Australopithecus. Just as I said earlier, how every characteristic that exists in Homo habilis seems to be an exaggeration on traits that showed up in Australopithecus, that same fact is true of characteristics from Homo erectus, which seem to be an exaggeration on characteristics seen in Homo habilis, or early genus Homo as a whole. And the characteristics seen in Homo sapiens are mere exaggerations on characteristics which first emerged in Homo erectus. Such is the nature of evolution, such is descent with modification. And that is why this little goober, from its discovery to every discovery since, makes it so hard to define what is human, what is genus Homo. It is just as difficult to point out where the human genus begins as it is to pick out where orange starts on a yellow to red color gradient, just as it should be. If evolution is true, that is. This problem is going to eventually come to encompass everything in the fossil record if we look for long enough, and assuming the fossil record is decent enough for other lineages of stuff as it is for hominins. The more fossils we find, the harder it is to draw these lines. Mo fossils, mo problems, if you will. Luckily, I'll be here to document all of it, because I am immortal, fueled by my love for paleontology. If you love this channel, you can support me in the free way by liking, commenting, and subscribing. It helps suggest these videos to other people who might find them interesting. And if you want to support me in a more financially motivated way, you can join my Patreon. Patrons get nothing right now, and they will probably continue to get nothing for the remainder of this semester because I'm trying to finish my dissertation. Well, okay, that's not quite true. They get their names at the end of every video. Speaking of which, I'd like to thank you from the bottom of my gentle and, of course, very modern heart for being such a curious primate, and I'll see you real soon next time.